February 12, 1943. Field of Henderson, Guadalcanal, Death's Dawn. 24 midnight blue fighters waited silently on the flight line as the rising sun cast long shadows across the coral runway. William Giese, Major, looked at his watch. 0600. These Vought F4U Corsairs were scheduled to perform their first combat mission in the Pacific War in 2 hours. It was an escort mission to Vella La Vella, 230 miles deep in Japanese-controlled airspace, not a regular patrol or training flight. The pilots had no idea that the arrival of this lone squadron would set off the most destructive fighter campaign in Solomon Islands. For more than a year, the Japanese had dominated these skies. Their legendary Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters were invincible, untouchable, and airborne masters. The death of that mythology was imminent. American soldiers had learned a harsh lesson from the Pacific War. Command the battlefield and the airspace. Lose everything, including the air. Japanese pilots have shown superior in training, tactics, and technology ever since Pearl Harbor. Any American fighter might be outturned by the Zero. It had experienced pilots who had been bred in China, honing their craft against less skilled opponents, and it could rise quicker and fly farther. With 700 aircraft and pilots with hundreds of battle hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy's elite air force based in Rabaul constituted the best concentration of naval aviation in the Pacific. Veterans who defeated the Americans at Pearl Harbor, the British at Singapore, and the Dutch in the East Indies. Individuals such as Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, who has achieved more than 60 wins. Before he passed away, Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa killed almost 80 people, making him Japan's ace of aces. They were more than just pilots. The sky over the Solomons served as their canvas. They were airborne combat painters, 3 air groups, the 204th, the 251st, and the Tainan. The best pilots in Japanese naval aviation, who had spent years training before the war, were assigned to these squadrons. Men who saw their planes as physical manifestations of themselves. The Tainan Air Group's commander, Lieutenant Junichi Sasai, had created strategies that optimized the Zero's strengths and minimized its drawbacks. His pilots flew in flexible formations that supported one another while allowing for individual initiative. By utilizing the Zero's remarkable agility to get on an enemy's trail and remain there until the kill was assured, they had mastered the art of the turning combat. Like a trapped animal, the F4U Corsair rested on the dusty coral surface of Henderson Field. Its distinctive silhouette, a profile that would soon haunt Japanese pilots' nightmares, was created by its inverted gull wings. The Corsair's 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine allowed it to reach speeds of almost 400 miles per hour. The unique bent wing design was necessary to offer sufficient ground clearance for the enormous 13-foot, 4-inch Hamilton Standard propeller. 6 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns with 750 rounds per minute each, 2,350 rounds of ammunition total, 400 rounds for each of the inner cannons, and 375 rounds for the outer pairs. A 2-second blast of gunfire that could cut a Zero in 2. However, the tail was not fully revealed by the raw specs. At first, the Corsair was thought to be too risky for carrier missions. When it landed, its large snout made it impossible to see forward. At low speed, it made brutal snap rolls because its left wing stopped before its right. On carrier decks, The oleo strut on the tail wheel had a propensity to bounce, sending the plane back into the air at the worst possible time. These same qualities that made it difficult to fly would make it deadly in combat. But the Navy had rejected it for carrier service, calling it an enemy eliminator. It had unparalleled acceleration and climb rate, thanks to the same power that made it challenging to handle. Because of its sturdy design, which increased weight, it was also able to withstand damage that lighter fighters could not withstand. Before reaching Guadalcanal, VMF 124's Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh had only flown 25 hours on the Corsair. Walsh was a former military guy who knew mechanics and had gained his wings via hard work rather than Annapolis ancestry. He was reared in Jersey City after being born in Brooklyn, and in 1933, at the age of 17, he joined the Marine Corps. Prior to receiving his wings, he worked as an aviation mechanic, so he had a deep grasp of what made airplanes function and what didn't. There was more to the Corsair than just an aircraft. It was 14,000 pounds of violence under control. You possessed death's own scythe if you could control its temperament. The pilots of VMF 124 were a diverse group of Americans, former mechanics and store clerks who had found their talent for flying, college graduates who had forsaken comfortable futures for gold wings, and farm lads from Iowa who had never seen the ocean until enlisting in the Marines. They had little combat experience and were young, with the majority being in their early 20s. Although they had put in a lot of training at Camp Kearney in San Diego, nothing could prepare them for the realities of fighting seasoned foes who had been murdering Americans since Pearl Harbor. The Japanese were getting ready for another day of air operations at Rabaul across the Solomon Sea. Vunacanao, Lakunai, Rapopo, Tobera, and Karavat were the 5 airfields that made up the expansive base complex. The cruisers and destroyers of the combined fleet were anchored at Simpson Harbor. Thousands of support workers, including mechanics, armorers, communications specialists, and medical professionals, were stationed in the town itself. With its ring of fighters and anti-aircraft weapons, it appeared to be impregnable, making it the Gibraltar of the South Pacific. The 204th Air Group's Lieutenant Tetsuo Mi went over the reconnaissance reports from the morning. An estimated 40 to 50 fighters of various classes, primarily antiquated P-40s and stubby F-4F Wildcats, made up the American force at Guadalcanal. Nothing was too much for the Zeros. The Tainan Air Group, renamed the 251st, had suffered troops, and the 204th had just landed at Rabaul to replace them. Many of the pilots were guys who had practiced flying against Chinese and Soviet pilots during the China campaign. They saw Americans as less capable adversaries who lacked the Japanese soldiers' commitment and spiritual discipline. However, the reconnaissance images taken that morning revealed something new. 24 aircraft, longer than P-40s and larger than Wildcats, with characteristic bent wings. They had no designation in naval intelligence. Most likely, another American design that failed was hurried into service. The Americans were always attempting to use stronger armor and weapons to make up for their pilots' lack of ability. With the Buffalo, it hadn't been successful. With the P-39, it had not worked. Why should there be any differences with this new aircraft? On February 12, 1943, VMF 124's first combat mission started at 8:00 a.m. To accompany a PBY Catalina rescue operation to Sandfly Bay, Vella La Vella, 12 Corsairs took off from Henderson Field. The mission profile was simple: give top cover while 2 pilots were being rescued by the flying boat. Expect no encounter with the enemy. The new squadron will be blooded with a milk run, with their engines operating nicely in the chilly early air. The Corsairs ascended gradually to 18,000 feet. Beneath them, the Catalina slowed and stumbled at 2,000 feet. The formation was commanded by Major G's, who was always looking up for danger. The Japanese had a tendency to show up out of the blue, generally. He constantly reminded his pilots to stay in formation, pay attention to your wingman's tail, and never attempt to turn with a zero. Make use of the speed, firepower, and damage-absorbing capabilities of the Corsair. Strike and flee, climb and dive. Never, ever engage in a low-altitude turning battle with a zero. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh noticed activity below 20 minutes into the flight. 9 Zeros ascending from the southeast, preparing to attack the sluggish Catalina. The Japanese employed forward strips to increase the coverage of their fighters, and they had most likely taken off from Buin or Balale. Over the radio, Walsh's voice crackled. "Bandits, 800 clock low, climbing." The time had come. 9 Japanese veterans in the most successful aircraft of the war against 12 American novices in an unproven fighter. Diving from 18,000 feet, Walsh rolled inverted and pulled through in a split S. He had never flown anything that accelerated like the Corsair. At 350, 400, and 425 mph, the airspeed indicator brushed past. Although they stiffened, the controls were still responsive. Even if the Zeros tried, they couldn't keep up at this pace. Under the strain, their wings would break off due to aerodynamic forces that their designers had not foreseen. After lining up on the opposing plane in pursuit, he pressed the trigger after waiting for the wingspan to fill his gun sight. At 900 feet, 6 streams of incendiary shots that penetrated armor came together. When it came to the Zero's exposed fuel tanks, the API ammo was deadly. The Japanese combatant broke apart. No flames, no explosion. Like a toy shattered by an unseen hammer, it just fell apart in midair. The engine tore free from its mounts, the wings detached from the fuselage. There was never an opportunity for the pilot to escape. G-forces crushed Walsh into his seat as he shandelled back toward altitude after pulling up forcefully. 1 kill, 1 pass. Following his lead, the other Corsairs dove and climbed, slicing through the Japanese formation with their greater speed. 4 minutes were spent in the interaction. 3 of the Zeros were falling in fragments toward the water as they ran away. There were no lost Corsairs. They hadn't even been struck. There was a significant change in the tactical equation. The prey have turned into the hunts. At full speed, the surviving Japanese aircraft, most likely from the freshly arrived 582nd Air Group at Rabaul, withdrew north. They had seen something that contradicted all of their preconceived notions about air warfare. The debriefing in Rabaul that night was solemn. According to the pilots that survived, they came into a brand new American fighter that was incredibly fast and powerful. They encountered a new American fighter type above Vela La Vela, according to their thorough and alarming report. Superior dive and speed properties, superb firepower, unable to participate in conventional turning warfare. The efficacy of 7.7mm weapons is negated by armor protection. Request information on aircraft identity and performance metrics right away. The study was the first to recognize that the air battle over the Solomons had undergone a fundamental shift. The new American fighter was nicknamed Whistling Death by Japanese pilots within a week because of the characteristic sound the Corsair made during a high-speed dive, a banshee scream produced by air rushing through the oil cooler intakes in the wing roots. It was a battle cry that heralded execution from above, a sound that would come before destruction. On islands occupied by the Japanese, ground forces grew to fear it. Death was only a few seconds away when they heard the whistle. The effect was tremendous and instantaneous. Previously accompanied by a dozen fighters, Japanese bomber flights to Guadalcanal now needed 20 or 30. Losses were significant even then. Because of its speed advantage, the Corsair was able to decide how and when to engage. As they attempted to defend bombers from cutting attacks they were unable to withstand, Japanese pilots were continuously on the defensive. The 8 Marine fighter squadrons in the Solomons, VMF-121, VMF-122, VMF-123, VMF-213, VMF-214, VMF-215, VMF-221, and VMF-222 were all switching to Corsairs by March 1943. There were enough of the bent-wing fighters for each unit. There were expenses associated with the change. Due to the Corsair's harsh flying qualities, 7 aircraft were lost to operational mishaps within the first month of operation. Accidents involving landings were frequent. Pilots were unable to see the runway during final approach due to the large nose. Their approach had to be curved, with only a last-minute straightening out. If you make a mistake, the aircraft would be flipped on its back by the strong torque from the massive propeller. However, those who were able to master the bent-wing bird had a weapon that could subdue any foe. In the Pacific, the Corsair revolutionized air warfare. It was a swift and decisive tactical change. The twisting dogfights that had benefited the nimble Zero were abandoned by American pilots. Rather, they used boom and zoom tactics, which involved firing while plunging from a height and then ascending away before the adversary could react. The speed at which the Corsair could descend would rip the wings off a Zero. It could take hits that lighter Japanese fighters couldn't withstand. Above all, it had the ability to capture and eliminate any Japanese aircraft from a favorable position. The Japanese made an effort to adjust. At the Japanese training bases, new strategies were created, including coordinated attacks from various directions, attempts to force Corsairs into low-speed turning battles, and focusing on the aircraft's few weak points, such as the oil cooler intakes and the cockpit canopy rails, where the armor was thinnest. But American advancements offset each adaptation. The Thack Weave, a defensive maneuver that ensured mutual assistance, was used by Corsair pilots when Japanese pilots discovered how to strike from directly astern to circumvent the forward-firing weapons. Corsairs simply refused to engage below 250 mph when Zeros attempted to take advantage of their better climb rate at low speeds. Lieutenant Walsh commanded a division of 4 Corsairs during a fighter sweep over the Russell Islands on April 1, 1943. At 10,000 feet, the morning was clear with sporadic clouds, making for ideal cover. From Munda Airport, 30 Zeros climbed to intercept them. Such odds would have guaranteed American pilots' deaths in earlier engagements. But Walsh had researched the capabilities of the Corsair and devised new strategies. The Corsairs covered each other's climbing recoveries, coordinated their dive assaults, and maintained their altitude advantage rather than fighting a broad brawl. With Corsairs jumping from 20,000 feet, shooting and then zoom climbing back to altitude, the combat became into a vertical battle. The Zeros struggled to keep their airspeed while clinging to their propellers in an attempt to follow. They were waiting for the next Corsair in the diving rotation at that point. In just 7 minutes, Walsh himself demolished
Stay on
3
target.
Zeros.
We've got flak coming in.
The
Bombs
pattern
away.
was the same for every kill. Dive, shoot, ascend, and relocate. 2 more were shot down by Lieutenant Archie Donahue, his wingman. 11 wins and no losses were reported by the 4 Corsairs. Mechanics found that all 4 planes had just 6 bullet holes when they touched down at Henderson Field. The Corsair's armor was too strong for the Zero's 7.7mm machine guns to breach. The sturdy American fighter needed repeated shots to be damaged by their 20mm guns, which were lethal against smaller aircraft. However, surviving long enough to aim was necessary to get those hits. Furthermore, survival was becoming less and less feasible given the Corsair's speed and weaponry. The thickness of the armor plate behind the pilot's seat prevented 20mm shots from passing through. Anything short of a direct cannon shot might be deflected by the bulletproof glass windscreen. Dozens of bullet holes might be absorbed by the self-sealing fuel tanks without igniting. Growing despair was evident in the Japanese response. Coast observers reported intelligence that veteran pilots were being pulled out of Rabaul and returned to Japan to train replacements. However, the losses were increasing more quickly than replacements could be made, and training required time. Over the Solomons, the Japanese Navy's meticulously developed cadre of skilled pilots, men with years of training and combat experience, were being bled white. By May 13, 1943, Kenneth Walsh had accomplished a feat never previously accomplished by an American pilot. With 5 wins certified, he became the first Corsair ace. The 5th kill occurred when Walsh was up against 3 Zeros in a brawl over the Russell Islands. He assaulted rather than fled, the more rational course of action. He made 3 passes, shooting down 1 Zero each, using the Corsair's greater speed. At 5,000 feet, the final Japanese pilot, who was most likely an experienced pilot based on his aggressive maneuvers, attempted to push Walsh into a turning battle. In response, Walsh climbed straight up, going vertical, until the Zero halted and fell away. The Zero attempted to recover, but he turned over and dived, catching it. The 50s fired a lengthy burst that split the adversary fighter in 2. Walsh's score was 10 2 weeks later. The change was striking. A pilot with little experience in a Navy fighter that was rejected rose to prominence as one of America's top aces in just 3 months. The man had conquered the machine, and the machine had produced the man. Walsh, however, wasn't alone himself. The capabilities of the Corsair were being discovered by dozens of Marine pilots. Over the Solomons, names were being inscribed in the sky that would become legendary. In just 6 months, VMF 215's Lieutenant Robert Hansen would amass 25 victories, becoming the war's highest-scoring Corsair ace. His method was straightforward but efficient. Rise above the adversary, drop as fast as he can, shoot at close range, and then ascend away before they realize what has happened. He painstakingly killed 5 Japanese fighters in a single operation on January 14, 1944, as they attempted to defend a bomber formation. The success of Corsair squadrons as a whole, rather than individual aces, was the true surprise for Japanese pilots. Bombers could be escorted all the way to Rabaul and back, because to the aircraft's 1,000-mile range when equipped with external tanks. Before, Japanese fighters had to savage the defenseless bombers after waiting for the American escorts to turn around. What had been milk runs for Japanese interceptors became lethal gauntlets when the Corsairs accompanied the bombers to the objective and back. In order to target American ships in Guadalcanal, more than 100 Japanese aircraft took out from Rabaul on June 16, 1943. 32 Corsairs from 4 Marine squadrons confronted them. Air dominance in the Pacific was completely reversed in the next fight. The Japanese formation consisted of improved armamented Model 22 Zeros and new Model 32 Zeros with a smaller wingspan for a higher roll rate. It made no difference. 6 Corsairs were lost for every 77 Japanese aircraft destroyed, a terrible 13-to-1 death ratio that would be often repeated. After surviving the battle, experienced Lieutenant Commander Teizo Tanimizu, who has over 30 wins, said, "The new American fighters do not fight as we do. Before we can respond, they fire their awful weapons, strike like hawks from above, and climb away. Our Zero has lost its superiority." His report was received by Admiral Yamamoto just weeks before the Admiral's tragic confrontation with American P-38s, another instance of American fighters destroying Japanese aircraft with superior speed and firepower. "We are being slaughtered by an enemy we cannot catch and escape." Even the Corsair's military victory was outweighed by its psychological impact. Fear gripped Japanese pilots who had never experienced defeat. Primitive fear was evoked by the characteristic whistle of a diving Corsair. When the presence of Corsairs was verified, pilots refused missions, according to ground staff at forward sites. When raids escorted by Corsair were anticipated, some pilots became grounded due to unexplained illnesses. In the heat of Corsair gun barrels, the aura of Japanese air dominance that had been meticulously fostered since the start of the war vanished. The Corsair's function grew beyond fighter missions in the summer of 1943. Initially, Marine pilots found that the aircraft was capable of carrying a single 500-pound bomb, and later a 1,000-pound bomb on the centerline rack. With the ability to battle its way to a target, deliver ordnance with dive bomber accuracy, and then fight its way home, the Corsair evolved into a fighter bomber. Once impervious to jet strafing, Japanese defenses were now under withering attack from bombs dropped by Corsair. The Black Sheep Squadron, VMF 214, commanded by Major Gregory Pappy Boyington, was a prime example of how the Corsair revolutionized air warfare. Boyington, who was already an ace from his Flying Tigers days in China, knew the Zero and the Corsair. His tactical advancements countered the Zero's advantages while maximizing the Corsairs. In reality, the Black Sheep were a group of troublemakers, misfits, and replacement pilots who didn't mesh well with other squadrons. Boyington combined them to form the Solomon's most successful fighter unit. Their position as orphans, pilots without a permanent squadron assignment, inspired the squadron's moniker. However, they turned into murderers under Boyington's direction. VMF 214 lost just 12 Corsairs and destroyed 97 Japanese aircraft in 84 days of battle, an 8-1 kill ratio that would have been unthinkable only months before. Along with many land facilities, they also destroyed 21 warships ranging from barges to destroyers. Boyington led 24 Corsairs in a fighter sweep over Balal, a Japanese airstrip near Bougainville's southernmost point, on September 16, 1943. There was a significant concentration of Japanese combatants at the field, according to intelligence. They were caught by 50 Zeros, who sprang from the coral strip like enraged hornets. Such odds would have been suicidal in the last battle. However, Boyington had taught his pilots how to manage their energy so they could always keep their speed and altitude advantage. In a lethal aerial ballet, Corsairs and Zeros climbed, dove, and turned as the conflict unfolded in 3 dimensions. However, one partner had all the benefits in this ballet. 20 Japanese fighters were destroyed without any casualties by the Black Sheep. Boyington became an ace in a day after accounting for 5 himself. His strategies were straightforward but powerful. Never give the adversary a known target, stay high, and move quickly. Before the Japanese realized they were being attacked, he would drop from 25,000 feet, frequently out of the sun, fire a burst, and be ascending back up. There were several technological factors that contributed to the Corsair's superiority. Because of its power, the R-2800 engine was able to sustain energy during vertical maneuvers that would otherwise stall a zero. The Corsair's supercharged engine kept running at high altitudes with thin air, while the Zero's performance drastically declined. Above 10,000 feet, the efficiency of the Hamilton standard propeller provided higher acceleration and climb rate. Because to its sturdy design, which included self-sealing fuel tanks, redundant control systems, and armor plate surrounding the cockpit, the aircraft could withstand damage that would have destroyed 3 Zeros. The weapons of the Corsair were lethal. At a distance of 300 yards, 6.50 caliber machine guns could fire 80 rounds per second on target. Incendiary gunfire that pierces armor might shred control surfaces, burn fuel tanks, and enter engine blocks. According to Japanese pilots, getting attacked by Corsair fire was like to being struck by sledgehammers. Aircraft destroyed in flight rather than simply going down. But conflicts weren't won by technology alone. Pilots, as well as airplanes, were created by American industry. Every month, hundreds of talented pilots were graduating from American training programs, while Japan struggled to train replacements for their growing losses. Before the war, the Naval Air Training Command had just 2 major stations. Today, it has dozens of facilities nationwide, including advanced training facilities in Jacksonville and Miami, operational training facilities in San Diego and Hawaii, and primary training facilities in Pensacola and Corpus Christi. Each pilot had 300 hours of flying time, including 50 hours of type time when they arrived at the theater. In comparison, the total hours of Japanese replacements were frequently less than 100, and occasionally as low as 60. Even mediocre American pilots could overcome seasoned Japanese aces thanks to the Corsair's margin of advantage. Errors that would have been deadly in a Zero were forgiven by the aircraft. Pilots were able to withdraw from adverse circumstances due to its speed. They made mistakes in judgment, yet its armor saved their lives. In August 1943, Japan's top aviation strategist and one of the masterminds of the Pearl Harbor attack, Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, paid Rabaul a visit. "The enemy's new fighter has revolutionized air combat," he said in a brutally honest assessment. "Our strategies, developed over many years, are no longer effective. We require brand new planes, training, and everything else. We don't have time, though." His report to Tokyo suggested that offensive activities be halted and the remaining pilot strength be saved for the defense of the home islands, because they are killing us faster than we can adapt. The suggestion was disregarded. Attrition was a harsh mathematician. Japan had about 400 first-line pilots in the Solomons when the Solomons War started. There were more than 300 deaths by August 1943. Their substitutes were inexperienced and incompetent. On the other hand, American pilot quality steadily increased. Newcomers learned from each returning veteran. Combat-tested tactics were quickly applied to training. In 1943, a learning curve that had claimed so many American lives in 1942 was turned into a teaching tool. Even other fields saw innovation spurred by the Corsair. The British Fleet Air Arm created new methods in response to the aircraft's first ship landing issues. They found that the visibility issue was resolved by a curving approach to the carrier deck, which allowed them to see the landing signal officer until the very last second. The oleo strut on the back wheel was modified to lessen bouncing. Accidents were decreased by better pilot training tailored to the unique characteristics of the Corsair. Successful operations from American carriers by the end of 1944 allowed Corsairs to contribute their firepower to the rapid carrier task formations. Lieutenant Commander John Tommy Blackburn's Navy Jolly Rogers, the VF-17, showed how adaptable the Corsair is for uses other than combat aircraft. Because of Navy reservations over the viability of the Corsair as a carrier, the squadron was initially assigned to the carrier Bunker Hill and was land-based in the Solomons. In the end, it turned out to be a boon. VF-17 could optimize the Corsair's payload and range by operating from shore bases. The employment of Corsairs as fighter bombers was first introduced by Blackburn's pilots. They created Corsair-specific dive bombing methods, hanging 1,000-pound bombs under the center line and finding that lowering the landing gear served as a useful diving brake. During the attack on Rabaul on November 11, 1943, VF-17 Corsairs shot down 18 Japanese aircraft, dropped their bombs on target, and then shot down 5 more as they were leaving. The Corsair's capacity to perform several roles changed its function from interceptor to offensive weapon. The squadron had an outstanding record. The Jolly Rogers destroyed 152 Japanese aircraft in 76 days of battle, or about 2 every day. Tommy Blackburn, the squadron's commander, was responsible for 11 of the wins. The fact that VF-17 never lost an aircraft they were escorting to enemy fighters is more significant. The umbrella of protection was total. Attacking American bombers meant engaging Corsairs, and facing Corsairs meant likely death, Japanese pilots discovered. The achievement of individual pilots in VF-17 was impressive. With a total of 17 wins, Lieutenant Ira Kepford became the first Corsair ace in Navy history. His method was to approach, get extremely near, and then shoot. He would launch all 6 guns in a deadly point-blank volley after diving on an enemy aircraft and holding fire until he could sight the pilot in the cockpit. It worked, but it was risky. During one mission, he used fewer than 100 rounds of ammunition to shoot down 4 Japanese fighters in a matter of minutes. Desperation was evident in the Japanese Navy's response. Improved armor protection, including a 55mm bulletproof glass windscreen, greater armament with belt-fed 20mm cannons, and a higher dive speed capable of 460 mph were all features of the improved Model 52 Zero. However, the Zero's renowned mobility was diminished by these weight-adding changes, which did not equal the Corsair's power. Given Japan's industrial constraints, the effort to battle the Corsair on its own terms was an engineering admission of loss that would never work. New aircraft types were also introduced by the Japanese. Specifically, the Kawanishi N1K2J was created to take against American aircraft as the Corsair. It was a strong foe with high performance, armor protection, and big armament. However, it came too late and in too few to have any impact. The majority of Japan's seasoned pilots had perished by the time sizable numbers made it to combat units. With more than 30 victories, Lieutenant Naoshi Kano was one of Japan's most aggressive aces and created unique anti-Corsair strategies. Before the Corsair could react, he would arrive from right underneath at full climb rate, fire a single deadly burst, and then stall away. Kano used this method to effectively destroy 2 Corsairs on December 17, 1943. However, VMF 215 Lieutenant Robert Hansen was waiting when he made a third effort. Hansen jumped through his own formation, recognizing Kano's pattern, and caught the Japanese ace in an ascending spin. Kano's career was destroyed in 2 seconds by 6 .50 caliber firearms. The greatest of Japan was no longer able to compete. The strategic victory of the Corsair was the isolation of Rabaul. By November 1943, Corsair escorted bombers were attacking the once powerful Japanese fortress every day. The remnants of the 5 airfields were cratered. The cemetery of sunken ships was Simpson Harbor. As the war progressed, the 100,000 Japanese soldiers stationed there were severed and left to wilt on the vine. It had been accomplished with air power, namely the Corsair, rather than an expensive invasion. American Corsairs dominated the Solomon skies by January 1944. Japanese daylight activities came to a complete stop. Raids were carried out under conditions that grounded American fighters, especially at night. To protect the inner perimeter, the few seasoned Japanese pilots that remained were pulled back. They were replaced by youths who could hardly fly, let alone fight. They perished in large numbers. Occasionally, whole formations were destroyed without winning a single battle. One of the few Japanese aces still alive, Lieutenant Sadamu Komachi, wrote in his notebook, "I saw 12 of our planes combat 8 American Corsairs today. 9 of ours were on fire in a matter of minutes. The surviving ran away. I didn't try to assist. 1 more 0. What might it do? We have lost the war in the air. We've already passed away. Our bodies just aren't aware of it yet." The influence of the Corsair went beyond winning percentages. Japanese interception had made strategic bombing operations difficult, but now they were able to proceed without any problems. With constant close air support, American ground forces made progress. From dispersed island bases, supply routes that formerly needed a huge fighter escort now functioned under Corsair umbrella support. Nowhere in the Solomons was immune from American air power because of the aircraft's 1,000-mile range. The actions of Marine First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh on August 15th and 30th, 1943, perfectly encapsulated the superiority of the Corsair. Despite being hit twice by his Corsair, Walsh repeatedly plunged into a Japanese formation, assaulting American vessels on the 15th. Outnumbered 6-1. He destroyed 2 dive bombers and 1 fighter. His life was spared by the armor plate. Upon post-flight examination, his aircraft had more than 50 bullet holes, none of which had reached critical locations. After his engine failed during an escort mission 2 weeks later on August 30th, Walsh landed at Munda, got into another Corsair, and flew again to continue his journey. He launched an unreserved attack after coming across 50 Zeros over Kahili alone. Before being shot down himself, he killed 4 opposing fighters in the subsequent battle. Before being saved by a flying boat, he spent hours on his life raft after emptying out over the ocean. After being awarded the Medal of Honor, he went back to fighting. He had won 21 battles before the conclusion of the war, all in Corsairs, against ostensibly better Japanese pilots. With every Corsair variation, the technology gap grew. One of the F4U-1A's minor shortcomings was addressed by the addition of a bubble canopy for better vision. The pilot's perspective was further enhanced by a 7-inch seat elevation. Instead of machine guns, the F4U-1C installed 4 20mm cannons, each of which could fire 120 rounds. The force of the blow was terrible. The Zero may have its wing torn off with a single explosion. In addition to its cannons, the F4U-1D could carry 8 5-inch rockets, or 2 1,000-pound bombs. Subsequent models could be equipped with torpedoes, napalm tanks, or Tiny Tim rockets. Every enhancement addressed battle lessons gained, with changes implemented within months after identification. Engineers changed the exhaust system after pilots complained about carbon monoxide leaking into the cockpit. Softer oleos were added to the tailwheel strut when it was found to be excessively rigid for carrier landings. New sets were installed as pilots requested improved radio equipment. Due to industrial constraints and a lack of resources, Japanese aircraft development was unable to keep up with this rate of innovation. 1 year has passed since the Corsair's combat debut in February 1944. Over 600 Japanese aircraft were destroyed by Marine and Navy Corsair squadrons in under a year, while less than 80 were lost to enemy action. The 11-1 kill ratio signified a strategic shift in addition to tactical dominance. Once Japan's biggest edge, air dominance was now America's certain way to win. The figures were astounding. In fight after encounter, Corsair squadrons were attaining remarkable kill rates. In single missions, individual pilots were earning aces. Japanese formations were being destroyed without causing their assailants any casualties. It wasn't a battle. It was a case of execution. The Japanese were aware of it. The Americans were aware of it. Additionally, all sides were aware of the implications for the outcome of the conflict. In a report to the Navy General Staff, Japan's top aerial planner and mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attack, Captain Minoru Genda, evaluated the situation with remarkable candor. The Corsair has rendered our entire naval aviation doctrine obsolete. For 20 years, we prepared to fight a war that has now ended. The Americans improved the aircraft, trained better pilots, and altered the regulations. We are unable to catch up. We can only pass away honorably. The human cost was enormous. During the Solomons War, Japan lost almost 2,000 naval aviators, most of them to Corsairs. In addition to being pilots, these individuals were teachers, squadron commanders, and tactical innovators, all of whom contributed invaluable knowledge that had been gathered over many years. A carrier pilot had to complete 3 years of training in the Japanese Navy prior to the conflict. By 1944, boys who had received fewer than 6 months of instruction were being sent to fight. The outcomes were catastrophic and expected. Despite their size, the American losses were long-lasting. Corsairs were produced industrially more quickly than they were used in battle. By 1944, 300 Corsairs a month, or one every 82 minutes, were being produced by Vought. Brewster and Goodyear, respectively, added their manufacture under license as F3A and FG versions. Since Pearl Harbor, pilot training programs have grown rapidly, producing competent replacements who were more prepared for combat than their predecessors. Due to a combination of institutional knowledge and combat experience, Corsair pilots became more deadly with each passing generation. The Corsair was as valuable in psychological warfare as it was in physical destruction. In her nightly broadcasts, English-language propaganda broadcaster Tokyo Rose acknowledged the impact of the aircraft, cautioning American pilots that the whistling death brings death to those who fly it as well. However, her warnings were vacuous. Japanese pilots were aware that running was necessary for survival when Corsairs came, and running alone might not be sufficient. The final battle of Major Gregory Pappy Boyington demonstrated the capabilities and limitations of the Corsair. Leading a sweep over Rabaul on January 3, 1944, Boyington shot down his 26th and 27th before being shot down himself. Ground fire and opposing fighters struck his Corsair, which ultimately collapsed due to cumulative damage. He lived through the rest of the war in Japanese prison camps after being caught. His tragedy proved that fighting was still deadly even in a better plane. However, his squadron's continuing success without him, destroying 94 more Japanese planes, showed that the Corsair's edge went beyond personal prowess. With or without their well-known captain, the Black Sheep continued to rank among the Pacific's top-scoring squadrons. The plane itself had evolved into the ace-maker, transforming competent pilots into legends and mediocre pilots into murderers. The Pacific was shaken by the strategic ramifications. Japan's most skilled naval strategist was killed in April 1943 when Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was shot down by P-38 Lightnings, which were made possible by Corsair suppressing Japanese fighters. Japan's most crucial base was eliminated without an invasion, thanks to the reduction and isolation of Rabaul, which was made possible by Corsair air supremacy. With each landing backed by Corsair squadrons, the Marine island hopping campaign intensified, ensuring that American Marines would never again engage in combat without air protection. Corsairs flew from carriers and ground sites during the 1944 Philippines campaign. By that time, a combination of aircraft improvements and pilot training had resolved the original ship landing issues. From the USS Essex, Marine Squadrons VMF-124 and VMF-213 provided ground support and fleet defense. In the biggest naval conflict in history, their presence over the Leyte Gulf contributed to the American triumph. Even the doctrine of carrier operations was altered by the Corsair. Pilots in the British Royal Navy devised methods to safely land the challenging aircraft on flight decks after it was first denied for deployment on carriers. All carrier aircraft now use the curved approach pattern they invented. By the end of 1944, Corsairs were flying from American carriers after their success persuaded the U.S. Navy to change their mind. By the conclusion of the war, Corsairs were operating out of dozens of carriers, allowing them to reach as far afield as the Pacific. In June 1944, Japan's most well-known surviving ace, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, came into contact with Corsairs over Iwo Jima. He barely made it through despite his extensive experience, more than 60 victories. Only extraordinary flying talent allowed him to escape from his Zero, which was littered with bullets and had smoke filling the cockpit. Fighting Corsairs in a Zero was like fighting a modern tank with a cavalry sword, he said bluntly. Perhaps brave, but foolish and lethal. The maturity of the Corsair as a weapon system was proven during the Marianas Campaign in June 1944. Marine Corsair squadrons operating from island bases participated in the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot on June 19th, even though the Hellcat was the main Navy fighter participating. In one day, Japanese naval aviation lost more than 400 aircraft, the majority of which were destroyed by American fighters. Because of how unequal the kill rates were, American pilots felt bad about the carnage. It was target practice, not battle. The whole tale was revealed by the numbers. 2,140 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed by Corsairs in air-to-air combat by August 1945. During the Pacific War, they dropped 15,621 tons of bombs, which accounted for 70% of all bombs delivered by U.S. Navy and Marine fighters. Attacks by Corsair have sunk or damaged more than 400 Japanese ships. Originally unable to operate from carriers, the aircraft went on to become the most successful naval fighter in history. The longest manufacturing run of any World War II fighter, 12,571 Corsairs, would be produced until 1953. Corsairs were crucial in thwarting kamikaze strikes at Okinawa. They were able to stop suicide planes before they could reach the fleet because of their speed. Their ability to shoot made sure that, once struck, kamikazes were totally annihilated rather than only injured and unable to carry out their goal. Although Marine pilots referred to it as turkey shooting, it was a grave matter. If one kamikaze were to get through, it might cripple a carrier or sink a destroyer. However, the human element was not captured by data. Every wrecked Zero represented a Japanese pilot, someone's father, husband, or son, who was killed or captured. There was a fatalistic tone as Japanese aviators gradually realized they were going to be destroyed, not merely defeated. Desperation-driven kamikaze tactics were the last recognition that traditional air warfare against Corsairs was pointless suicide. After just 90 hours of flight time, young Ensign Teizo Yamamoto arrived in Rabaul in March 1944 and survived precisely one engagement with Corsairs. One note from his diary, which was found after the war, said, "Today I saw the bent-wing devils. My training class had 3 dead members. I took off running. I'm embarrassed, yet I'm still here. I'll probably join them tomorrow. The Americans' battle is not fair. They are only putting us to death." 80% of all U.S. Navy and Marine close support missions in Korea were flown by Corsairs, demonstrating the aircraft's longevity beyond World War II. The F4U version could transport 4,000 pounds of munitions thanks to its 2,300 horsepower engine. Lieutenant Guy Bourdillon shot down 5 North Korean planes, making him the sole prop ace flying a Corsair night fighter and the Navy's lone ace in Korea. While fighting in Indochina, French Navy Corsairs assisted Foreign Legion forces at Dien Bien Phu. The aircraft continued to be produced until 1953 and were used by several air forces throughout the world. During the soccer war between El Salvador and Honduras in 1969, the Corsair even made its last combat appearance. It was the final piston-engine fighter battle in history, with Corsairs being flown by both sides. Captain Fernando Soto of the Honduran Air Force may have been the final piston-engine fighter ace in history when he shot down 3 Salvadoran planes, including 2 Corsairs. For an aircraft that had transformed air warfare, it was a fitting conclusion. As he reviewed the development of the air war, Admiral John S. McCain Sr. said, "The Corsair did not simply defeat Japanese air power, it destroyed it. In 18 months, we moved from fighting for our lives to complete control. No one aircraft has ever altered the nature of combat so drastically in such a short period of time." The Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz, was even blunter. "We had air dominance anywhere and whenever we needed it because to the Corsair. The island-hopping campaign would not have been feasible without the Corsair. It was the key that opened the Pacific's Japanese defenses. An unexpected source provided the last testament. In his post-war biography, Emperor Hirohito listed 3 elements: the atomic bomb, the Corsair fighter, and American industrial capacity that rendered Japan's defeat inevitable. He claimed that our islands became indefensible when our pilots could no longer contest the skies. The blade that severed the Empire's lifeblood was the Corsair. Perhaps the most striking description came from Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who survived the war with 64 victories. The Zero was a rapier, light, agile, deadly in skilled hands. Heavy and strong, the Corsair was a broadsword that crushed everything in its path. The American had 10 broadswords for every rapier we had, and they didn't have to be samurai to handle them well. The rapier is superior in the hands of a samurai. A column of Marine Corsairs soared above on a steamy September 1945 morning as American occupation forces touched down in Japan. Over Tokyo Bay, where Japanese pilots had dominated 2 years prior, their curved wings created shadows. The message was obvious, but the conflict was ended. The time of the sky samurai was over. Born in the Solomon's furnace and forged in the Corsair's engine, the era of American air dominance had started. Lieutenant Kaneochi Muto, the final Japanese ace to engage in action with Corsairs, survived the war with 18 wins. Years later, when asked if he had ever fought the American boxer, he gave a sorrowful smile. Are you curious about combating Corsairs? This is the reality. Corsairs wasn't fought by you. If you were really fortunate and quick, you survived them. Most of us weren't. Death was represented by the bent-wing bird, because death always prevails in the end. Scattered throughout the Pacific is tangible proof of the Corsair's supremacy. The metal skeletons of planes that have fallen on islands ranging from Okinawa to Guadalcanal tell their stories. However, the ratio is instructive. Researchers find 10 or more Japanese planes for every Corsair crash they find. Some were killed in battle. On the ground, others were destroyed. When their pilots were murdered, several were just left behind because there were no one to take their position. Thousands of reels of gun camera video from the Marine Corps' archives document the last moments of Japanese planes. A Zero, Val, or Betty filling the gun sight, the flash of hits as .50 caliber bullets impact, bits falling off, flames erupting, and the enemy aircraft sliding out of frame are all very identical in the videos. The human cost, the young men, both Japanese and American, who perished in those metal coffins that fell from the sky, is not depicted in the movies. The metal bones of downed airplanes lie strewn thousands of miles deep in the Pacific Ocean. Both Zeros and Corsairs silently observe the brutal intensity of the air conflict. However, the ratio speaks for itself. 11 Zeros lie next to each Corsair on the ocean floor. When technology, training, and industrial power came together, the outcome was not warfare but execution, as demonstrated by the mathematics of victory, which was written in metal and measured in lives. Not only had the Corsair won a battle, it had completely changed the essence of air combat, demonstrating that any skill or experience advantage could be overcome by better technology used effectively. The solo warrior ace's heyday was coming to an end. The time has come for systematic technical air supremacy.